right, everybody. We'll get started. Thanks to everybody who's joining us for today's presentation by the ACLP Networking Subcommittee, Finding a CL Psychiatry Job 101, a virtual Q&A. My name is Chandra Kandai, and I'll be your host and moderator for this evening. Just FYI, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online for later viewing. So no need to take notes. And if you're coming in or have to leave a little early, the recording will be made available shortly. So just a quick overview of the webinar for today. We're going to do, just like in 15 minutes, a quick recap of why even do CL psychiatry, the application process, and networking opportunities at the upcoming CLP conference in November 2022 in Atlanta, Georgia. We're then going to introduce our awesome Finding a CL Job panel. And then the vast majority of the time today is going to be a Q&A with you, the attendees, which is going to be a mix of pre-sent questions you all sent in during registration and live questions from the audience, which you can put into the Q&A. So in general, why CL? Because we are the coolest subspecialty in all the land. There are many varied settings, from the traditional inpatient consults we all know and love from residency and fellowship, to being on med psych units, doing stuff in emergency psychiatry, outpatient clinics, even. Yes, CL outpatient is a thing. There are multiple models, such as the traditional consult model, proactive consults, integrated embedded models, collaborative care, even doing e-consults like curbsides. And then no other specialty of psychiatry can you sub-specialize in everything from addictions and burns to cardiac psychiatry, critical care, HIV, AIDS, neuropsych, palliative care, psych-onc, transplants, and women's mental health, and just the list goes on and on. So particularly during COVID-19, we've had a rise in the prominence of a subspecialty within the larger medical community, because we're treating neuropsych adverse effects of COVID-19, especially long COVID this far into the pandemic, helping patients and families and also staff cope with the psychological impact of COVID-19. CL is really taking the lead on that, advocating for psychiatric care of the underserved during this pandemic, and serving as psychological support for our hospital systems during COVID-19. I'll also add that CL psychiatry has a strong social justice role, because patients with psych and substance disorders are underserved in the general medical system, and minorities and underserved populations are heavily underserved in our mental health system overall. So we serve an important role in addressing disparities, because we have an embedded role within the larger healthcare system. We are an entry point often for vulnerable patients into mental health treatment, and there's a lot of opportunities for advocacy and education of physician peers and healthcare staff. So if advocacy and social justice is your thing, then really consider CL psychiatry. So easier said than done, though, because there's a lot of differences you may recall between applying the residency fellowship and applying the CL jobs. For example, residency fellowship, there's a list of programs. There's set discrete places that you can apply to. In CL jobs, there's no clear list of positions. Like, it's sometimes hard to even know if a job is out there or not. And there's theoretically infinite number of places you could be applying to. Residency fellowship, there's a pretty set timeline, versus CL jobs, especially if you're already an earlier mid-career, it can happen really any time of the year you decide to leave and go somewhere else. The residency and fellowship has a centralized process, whereas we don't have any centralized job application process for any job, much less CL. The residency fellowship, you have to pay for everything, at least in the pre-virtual interview days. In CL jobs, the standard is often, like most places, they will pay for your interview costs. Residency fellowship, it's very clear, like, these are your jobs, these are your rotations, this is what's expected, you're being graded. For jobs of any sort, but especially CL, there's no necessarily preset job duties expectations, and that can change as you go on. Residency fellowship, there's a set amount of minimum wage money you're gonna make and benefits. Like, it is what it is. Versus in CL jobs, the exciting but also scary thing is there's some room to negotiate. And there's many different types of jobs and many different amounts of salaries and benefits. Residency fellowship, there's a match. CL jobs, just like any job, there's no match. This may be the first time in your life you may be just applying for a job, which is both exciting and terrifying when you think about it. And lastly, residency and fellowship, there's a clear start date and end date. A job, you just like apply and you could be there forever, you could be there for a year. Like, there's no like set like sunset period. So things to think about as we enter the Q&A. So some things to think about when you're starting to look for CL jobs, like geographic location. Location. Where do you want to go? Where do you want to stay? Are you thinking about academic versus like a community or private organization? If reputation is important, you think about the reputation of the residence and fellowship, but also the department of a specific hospital or a medical center. Think about the number of other CL faculty. Do you want to be the only CL faculty in a place, and that way you get to really set the tone of CL, or would you rather be one amongst many faculty? Think about volume of consults, workflow, who's going to be on your team. Will you get the opportunity to work with like allied health professionals like APPs, social workers, nurses, etc.? Are there RVU requirements? Like, do you have to see a set number of consults per year, or is it just do whatever comes your way? What are the clinical opportunities, both inpatient versus outpatient, and will there be stuff opening up in the future? Benefits, salary is important. Like, we need to talk about money, but also things like health insurance, vacation, conferences, retirement. Does the job qualify you for public service loan forgiveness? If you're going for an academic job, ask them, do you get protected time, like 10%, 20% to like write and teach and do academic things? Do you get academic allowance costs? Do you get time for research or teaching and opportunities? What is the culture around diversity, equity, and inclusion at your division at your institution? For IMG applicants, will this place sponsor a visa? Does it qualify for a Conrad waiver? And lastly, can you moonlight at this place? And are you allowed to do side gigs, or can you only work for this institution? So, CL jobs, where do you even find them? There's no like US News and World Report of CL job listings, right? So the first place to look is at your home institution. Where you're training, do they have one? And would you like to stay, or would you like to go? Beyond that, places to look would be the organizational listings, like the ACLP has a job flash that actually goes on our listserv if you sign up for it. APA has a job central, and state societies and local societies often have listservs of their own of local jobs in your area. Institutional websites like my own UT Southwestern or Harvard or Stanford, Northwestern, or what have you, may just have job listings on their own website itself. Conferences often have people have exhibits which talk about coming and working for them. Word of mouth connections is really the best way to find jobs. And understand that many jobs are not listed. Both of the jobs I had, for example, were not listed anywhere. I just reached out, emailed, or I heard about them, and then I applied for them. So here's an example of just a way to contact programs. Again, we'll talk more about this in the Q&A, but just wanted to embarrass myself by giving you an example. So this is when I was in fellowship. I was thinking about going back to Chicago. So dear Dr. Cooper, an attending I remembered from my residency time. Happy New Year. This was around New Year. Hope this finds you well at UIC. I wanted to reach out as I heard from a friend that UIC might be hiring CL faculty. I'm in CL fellowship now at University of Washington, but would love to return to Chicago area one day. I would love your advice on how to apply for this, if still open, and whom to connect. Sincerely, although you may be a regards person or love or cheers, whatever your salutation of choice, I said myself and my position. Joey writes back, hi, John Dunn. Thanks for writing, and I hope you are doing well. We'd love to talk with you more about possibilities. If you email your CV to Juan Fan, MD, our Vice Chair for Clinical Affairs, he can start the discussions. Send the email. So then, this is my follow-up email. So this is an example of what we'd call a cover email or cover letter. I just emailed the vice chair, so the person in charge of hiring, and I said, this is who I am. This is my current position. I name dropped Dr. Cooper, being like, hey, you know this guy, he told me to come to you. So, and this is my interest in CL. And these are specific things I want to do, and this is why I want to come back to Chicago area. So I attached my CV. I would love to talk further, either by phone or person needed. Thank you for consideration. Have a nice weekend. Within a day, I got an email back from Dr. Fan being like, hey, let's set up a time to talk. We talked briefly over the phone, and then later that week, I got an interview, and the process started. So really something as straightforward as this, consider doing if you're looking for jobs. But we can talk more in the Q&A. The interview process itself, think about it, especially now that we're in like 80, like after distancing times, like, are we doing this in virtual or doing like in person? If you're currently in training or have a job, think, are you going to be taking days off to do this? Or are you going to be doing vacation days? And if it's virtual, it's often multiple rounds. So maybe you just have to take off like a few hours here and there versus an entire day. Some general tips we have for anybody applying for either a job or just for residency fellowship is, if it's virtual, ensure a quiet place with good Wi-Fi and lighting. Do not be doing this at like Starbucks or Panera, like in the middle of the day. Create a list of questions you want to ask during the interview ahead of time versus wishing you'd have asked a question later. Keep a copy of your application for each program. Know what you said, because if you wrote down you did something and they ask you about it and you don't remember that you did that thing, it is very embarrassing. Take it from me, I did that once, and I am not working at the place where that happened. Have PDFs of your CV and publications available if needed to send to interviewers. I say PDFs because just practically they're easier to load and send than Word documents by email. And lastly, thank the organization post-interview, especially thank staff and coordinators, because they're the people who make academic medical centers run. So once you get a job, you accept the job, you negotiate and you sign for a job, congrats. So now you have to think about what is the start date of your job versus the finish date of training of the last job. Are you gonna be taking off some time, or are you going straight to it? And if you take off time, are you gonna have health insurance and benefits during that time or not? Are there permanent licenses you will need, like a DEA? Like word to the wise, specific states like California, Texas, and New York, Massachusetts, they take a long time to get licenses. So plan ahead for that. And if the place you're working for knows what they're doing, they will warn you about that as well. If you're relocating, think about housing, if you're gonna do car versus public transit, what the benefits are gonna be like, if you need to find a new doctor, dentist, house of worship, etc. Is there a moving allowance, and is that paid to you ahead of time, or do you ask for reimbursement afterwards? And really reach out to current faculty for advice on this process, because if you chose the right place to work, they should want to help you make a smoother transition as possible. So Dr. Cheryl Fleisch was going to be one of our panelists, but unfortunately, she was directly in the path of Hurricane Ian. Fortunately, she and her partner are okay, but they have literally no food and water. So God bless her. She actually walked half a mile to get reception so she could just text us this advice. So please take it to heart. She wants you to know that nothing is non-negotiable in this process. So ask about everything. It's a buyer's market and you are the buyer. You may be made to feel otherwise, but you are the buyer. CL is a small community and using context is okay. Even just ask your supervisors if they have connections. If you're interested in a specific institution, you don't have to wait to see if they have a job posting. Just write them a brief email with an attached CV and cover letter to the CL service line chief. So the person specifically in charge of CL at that location. And really look for a place that is willing to invest in you as a person. Your direct supervisor is going to play a very important role. So let's look at, do they care? Are they present? What is their management style? So some specific networking events we wanted to highlight, because ACLP is working hard to really make this as explicit and member-friendly as possible. So the ACLP annual meeting is going to be coming up on November 9th to 12th. Atlanta, Georgia, at the Hilton Atlanta. So if you haven't already registered, you should, because it's gonna be awesome. The first in-person meeting since before COVID began. So the ACLP networking subcommittee has 3 events we just wanted to highlight. One is an ACLP live event on Thursday, which is gonna be a live stream trivia game, which is gonna be super fun. ACLP is going to be having a lunch where we can interact informally with experts and have 4 different breakout rooms. There's going to be a selfie of the day contest, which we'll be having every day of the conference. I have a different theme each day via the ACLP meeting app. So just fun ways to keep meeting new people and networking. In addition, the Early Career Psychiatrist Subcommittee has 2 specific events for y'all's networking needs. There's going to be a meet and greet with the current APA president, Dr. Rebecca Verdell, who is the CL psychiatrist, and APCO, Dr. Saul Levin. It'll be an interactive discussion of politics, ethics, and psychiatry geared towards early career psychiatrists. There'll also be an AMA, not against medical advice. This is Ask Me Anything, on Friday afternoon with an in-person Q&A and discussion with senior Academy members on a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today. Finding a job, building a career, work-life balance, navigating politics, women in medicine, so on and so forth. So again, many more reasons to be registered for CLP 2020. So additional resources for prospective job applicants in the audience. The APA has a great CL psychiatry homepage, which can kind of serve like why CL and take you from there, as well as an APA council on CL psychiatry with a lot of cool resources. ACLP has these things called SIGs, or special interest groups, which cover a lot of different topics from burns to critical care to women's mental health, which is a great way to network and meet other people in your specific field of interest. In addition, we also have an early career psychiatrist SIG and listserv that you should be joining if you're not already. But national conferences, ACLP is always in November of each year, and the AP annual meeting is always in April and May of each year. Your local psychiatric societies and medical organizations could be a huge resource for finding jobs, especially in your local area that's not your home institution. And then honestly, Facebook has a lot of really great resources, physician only, like CLPen, Psychiatry Network and Psychiatric Physician Group, and Physician Community, that talks about not only like specific like job listings, but also questions about, is this a good salary or not? How to negotiate? What are things we're looking out for? Should I be moving from here or not? So now I'm going to stop the formal presentation, stop my share. And I'm going to take a chance to have the members of our panel introduce themselves. So first, David, who are you?
So David Phipps, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting. It's a great introduction, Shonda, by the way. I went to medical school in Florida, residency in South Carolina. I did 2 fellowships at Mayo Clinic. I did an addictions fellowship and a Consultation-Liaison psychiatry fellowship. Currently, my role is on the inpatient CL service, and I have an outpatient CL subspecialty focus in transplantation psychiatry, as well as bariatric surgery psychiatry, and sometimes those combine with each other. From the ACLP standpoint, I'm on the residency education subcommittee. I'm the chair of their mentorship work group, and I moderate their case conference webinar series. And I am the admin of the CL specific Facebook group CLPen, which was actually just mentioned.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us. Next, we'll move on to Dr. Valerie Hausneck. Who are you?
Hi, so I'm Valerie Hausneck. I am in Dayton, Ohio. I work for a community hospice organization that serves across the state of Ohio. I went to medical school here in Dayton at Wright State, and I did my adult residency at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. I do my position right now, I do a combination of outpatient palliative care and psycho-oncology. And I also do a lot of education for our organization around all topics mental health. And I run an e-consultation service for our hospice providers across the state.
Awesome, thank you so much for joining us. Next, I'll move on to Kamalika. Hello.
Hi, hi everybody. Thanks, Chandan, for arranging this excellent program every year, and great presentation, great slides. I think some of the audience is already asking for the PDF of the slides. I'm Kamalika Roy. I'm a CL psychiatrist. I did my medical school in India, residency in Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan, and CL fellowship in University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Then I worked as a faculty at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. And currently I am a psycho-oncology faculty at University of Washington. I work in Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. So I usually only do psycho-oncology work, but we also have a statewide e-consultation program for the state of Washington, Idaho, Montana, Alaska. As I'm part of that team as well, where we do just e-consults. And in ACLP, I'm the co-chair or maybe the vice chair of awards and fellowship subcommittee of ACLP. And I'm pretty active in the neuropsych SIG, where I usually coordinate the submissions every year for ACLP.
Awesome, thank you so much for joining us, Kamalika. Next, let's move on to Jay. Hi.
Hey, I'm Jay Gandhi. I am now an inpatient CL psychiatrist at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center. I've worn a few hats in my very short amount of time out of fellowship, and I'm happy to talk about those things and transitions across states. I've moved across state lines 3 times, including the move from fellowship, and in 4 years. So familiar with moves and transitioning early in career, and I'm happy to talk about that. Within ACLP, I am one of the co-chairs for the early career psychiatry SIG. So you might have seen my name pop up on there. And I'm part of the medical student education subcommittee, as well as the guidelines and evidence-based subcommittee, members on both of those. And ACLP is great. And yeah, thanks, Chandan, for organizing us.
Thanks so much, Jay. Last but not least, a special treat, because Dr. Fleisch had to step out because of the hurricane, one of our good friends, Mira Zain, was able to join us last minute. So Mira, hi, tell a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Mira. I am in California, did my med school actually in Canada at McGill, and then did residency at NYU, came over to Stanford for my fellowship, and then did the stay on, so I can talk about what it's like to stay at your, place that you did fellowship and the pros and cons of that. And did inpatient CL as well as ED, and developed an integrated behavioral health program and an e-consult program at Stanford. And now I've recently transitioned to doing work at San Mateo Medical Center, which is a county-based community hospital. And it is not academic in the same way, though it has a small residency. And it was an interesting process of transitioning, and do some work still at Stanford, also consulting with a couple tech corporations, since this is Silicon Valley area. At ACLP, I am a much less active, but still a part of the residency subcommittee member with David. And then I also am part of the Women's Mental Health SIG.
All right. Thank you all. So we already have a question in the live Q&A, I think inspired by a lot of the work you're all doing. So we'll answer live. Would love to hear more about e-consultation, how to go about finding such jobs. Thanks.
I can go ahead and start, probably because my answer is the simplest. So my position, I think, kind of like Chandan said, right, did not exist before I had it. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it could look like, what it would look like, because my organization and honestly the people that hired me had no idea. And so I basically built an e-consult service as a way to reach our hospice providers across the state, because, there's one of me in a statewide organization. So it was not a, it was a job that I created after I got here, not one that I found, I guess.
Yeah,
I
I will go next, Valerie. So that's a lot of work, honestly, to actually build an e-consult program that's also statewide. But many states actually have a statewide e-consult program. I know Washington does, Oregon also has it. I'm not sure whether California does or not, but these are state-funded program. A group of people actually got the grant from the state to run this program for several years, let's say 5 or 10 years. Usually these are run by the universities, and then the universities kind of collaborate with the other healthcare systems in our state. It's Providence mostly. And then they come up with this network where you have an EMR, you have like a coordinator who actually takes the call when somebody from, let's say, a nursing home is calling you, or somebody from the ER is calling you. So they take down all the information, and then the call is transferred to you. You just use the EMR to document, and sometimes, of course, you do not see the patient here. The e-consult is more like a curbside consult model done over tele platform. So you are actually not seeing the patient or communicating with them at all. You're just communicating with the provider, whoever is calling you. I think more and more states are coming up with state-funded programs because of the success of these initial programs, because you can reach a lot of rural places where there is no psychiatry at all.
can go from as well. And I think similar to Valerie, I ended up building the program to start at Stanford. And it depends on also what sort of setting you want to work in. And if you're thinking about making e-consults a full of your FTE, which is full-time equivalence. So if you're thinking about one FTE, what percentage of your work do you want that to be? So do you want it to be your full-time job and you're doing everything, virtually, versus are you wanting that to be a piece of your work? And then thinking about, right, because you're not having front, patient facing care, you are working solely with the providers. And then also, do you want to have access to the EMR versus are you okay with just having a conversation over the phone or via text with providers as well? Some of the state funded programs, because you are using a third party EMR to be able to converse with providers, you're not actually getting to review the patient's chart, versus if it's within a university or another hospital system, you're going to be able to actually dive into the patient's chart, take a look at things and get more detail there. You can always reach out to and find out about programs that have existing e-consultation programs, be it an academic medical center or be it a state, and then just send out questions. I haven't actually seen postings for e-consultation jobs. So this is one of those things where asking around and using connections and, asking, there are 3 of us on here that have talked, for instance, can potentially point you in directions of where you could potentially be doing that. So at Stanford, for instance, we have a doctor who is in Ohio, who used to be a fellow at Stanford, who is doing the e-consultations for the SHC side, but we are now looking, for instance, for e-consultants to broaden and start doing networking throughout California. So lots of informal ways you could find out about programs.
All right. Thank you so much, team. So I think a big lesson from this is that a lot of times these aren't advertised or may not be part of the initial position. Sometimes you either have to start them yourselves or be part of existing programs. But the best thing to do is just start asking around. Another question just came in right now to Q&A. How much is a good starting salary for academia versus community? I will say that this is a pretty hard question to answer because we are notoriously non-transparent, downright opaque with salary and payment. It's like a dirty word in like medicine in general, which is bad, right? At least all sort of disparities. But I wanted to ask y'all, how did you go about figuring out what was a fair salary for what you were doing, how much you get paid, like what were other people in your area getting paid? Like, how did you all even find that out? One, this was something we like very obviously did not talk about during residency and fellowship.
I can start here. I've interviewed a bunch. I mentioned I've crossed state lines a couple of times, so I've gone through the interview process a few times. I will say, talking to people in situations not exactly like this, but like in more local settings, talking to people who are willing to talk about salary. Also like mentors who I knew I could trust, that were only a few years like above me, was an important method by which to assess this. I'm just going to go ahead and drop some numbers related to some of the places that I've been around. So 4 years ago, 2018, when I interviewed for the first time for CL jobs, the salary that I was offered almost exactly by 3 or 4 different university institutions was right around 180K, like almost on the dot for all 4 of those different university institutions. I do think that number has increased since 2018 for the university. And this is like strict university settings in which it's like an academic place where you're going to be doing some amount of academic work, and non-university settings at that time, I was getting anywhere from 205 to 230, like at that time. And so like, that's not private settings. I wasn't interested in private. So someone else can maybe comment on private settings, because that's not a setting in which I've interviewed, because it's not something that was interesting to me. But I do know that colleagues of mine and friends of mine that have interviewed in private settings do get pretty significantly higher offers. But again, it just depends on where you're looking. And then I'll say I've interviewed in a few different places, and there are university settings that have offered higher numbers, and also university settings that have offered lower numbers than that 180 that I was throwing out there. And then I've essentially been able to kind of negotiate my way up, and the going rate has, as I said, over the past 4 years has been increasing. And I'm willing to share like what my starting salary was when I initially signed on to my first job, was $235. And I just so everyone knows, I've been at the VA like the whole time. So I haven't switched out of a VA system, but I have gone to different VAs. This is my third VA that I'm at. And I've kind of been able to negotiate my way upwards from there. But in regards to what's good, I think you do have to assess locally, like what is happening locally, what are people getting offered alongside you. I think there's a lot of DEI initiatives that are trying to flatten the disparities that have happened. And so while I agree with Dr. Fleisch that everything's negotiable, I do think that in the effort for institutions to be a little bit more equitable, that amount of negotiation for a starting salary is diminishing to try and even the playing field across gender, race, and other minority categories. So anyways, I talked for a while.
Yeah, I will go next. Moving from Midwest to West was really good kind of learning curve about salary how salary can be very different. I would say overall salary depends on a location, tier of the university or tier of the community program, wherever you are trying to go, and the setting where you will be working in. If you are working in VA or state facilities, they have their own tier system of salary. They will start you at level 7, level 5 versus level 9, then you move up through that level system. And also the cost of living. When I first was trying to find an academic job back in 2017, Providence, Rhode Island, big academic institution was offering somewhere between 160 to 180. And at the same time, OHSU was offering, Oregon Health and Science University was offering 215. So you can see the variability, and someplace in West Virginia was offering somewhere around 250. So it really varies depending on the tier of the university and also the location of the place. And also, I think we all should refer to at least the AAMC salary database, which is usually available in any good academic library. And the MGMA applies more to the community setting, and AAMC applies more to the academic setting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice that most was given. Most of my experience has been more in the academic side than in the private and equity and other areas. And I can say that whenever we're wanting to know anything about a specific place, whether it be salary ranges, whether it be the milieu of the place, whether it be kind of what is offered, what's available, and what's expected, one thing that really I think has been a good hard line sell is this concept of relationships. And so if you're able to create and maintain a relationship with someone from a different area, then it may bring about an easier discussion about a bit more of a socially difficult conversation, such as salaries. This isn't always as available for non-academic settings in comparison to academic settings, because the examples that I typically give is like, well, if you want to know about a place, if you could go to ACLP, find out who's speaking where, go to their presentation, ask a question, create a conversation, get their number, and start kind of getting a little more comfortable with that person and saying, oh, well, yeah, so what's it like where you're working right now? Do you like it there? What brought you there and what kept you there? And is it difficult to cost of living? I know your city's pretty big, kind of creating a conversation that came from an equal and similar interest that allows that collaboration would really open up the opportunity to ask some of these more difficult questions to where you don't feel pushed or uncomfortable when we're talking about negotiations and interview processes. That's been a very helpful piece that I found, just being able to have an excuse almost to talk with someone about it because you collaborated with them at the national conference.
Thank you all very much. So a lot of it is locally based. There are some more quote unquote objective databases out there. So I'm gonna name drop again a couple of things I mentioned. The AAMC faculty salary report, which should be available to most institutions that you're at, and the MGMA. A lot of the Facebook groups also just have threads we can look like, hey, like, is this salary fair for like with the area I'm looking at? It's a little like triggering because it reminds me kind of like the Chance Me threads from like Student Doctor Net, like back in the day, but like it can be helpful just to get the most information out there. But maybe, David, not like raise your hand, be like, hi, Dr. Phipps, great talk on bariatric surgery. How much do you make at Mayo Clinic? Maybe not a great question to like start with, you're suggesting, like build up to that.
Yeah, create a relationship. One of the things that the one things that I really value about ACLP in general is that it's small, but it's very collaborative. There are certain other societies that I've been part of that are extremely large and very difficult to actually get in a word edgewise to people who may be in a higher position or that had a really great talk and you actually wanted to talk with them about it. Versus ACLP, it's very easy to be able to sit down with someone and have a great collaborative discussion that would eventually lead to a relationship that could then open up to the questions and comments. So yes, I think it'd be an awkward question to ask in front of the microphone after you've made a presentation of what your salary is. But if you can show that there's a similar interest, that would lead to like a relationship that could eventually, exchange numbers and have a conversation afterwards, that brings about a little bit of an easier conversation in that regard. I found that typically what I described as a month's worth of time where you kind of meet them, have a similar interest, and then something builds over time to where it wouldn't probably even be necessarily asked within the few days that you would be interacting at ACLP.
Actually, to build off of that, a comment actually posted by one of our attendees says one thing to consider: California in general and Colorado now require salary ranges to be posted if an official job is posted. This may be a bigger trend of other states to help combat inequity, but less useful if this is done more informally. So just another thing to be aware of. So thank you so much. So a lot of questions coming in now, so we're just going to go back through them one by one, team. So if you have an interest in CL psychiatry, like women's health, emergency psychiatry, but no formal fellowship, would it be possible to get into the space? And I'm going to have Valerie start us on this one.
So I will say yes, because I did it. I'm not fellowship trained. I was telling these guys earlier, I finished residency in 2005 when fellowships were really just kind of building their steam and you could still be grandfathered in. Unfortunately, I moved to an area where there wasn't a lot of CL work available. Basically, hospitals would employ psychiatrists to do inpatient work, and the CL part was kind of on the side. And so I didn't work in CL for a number of years and only got back to it about 5 years ago. And, this organization, the ACLP, was huge in helping me to do that, because while I always had an interest in CL and I was always kind of keeping my ear to the ground, I didn't have a lot of geographic flexibility. So, getting back to going to the annual meetings, and like David said, people are so approachable, and just being able to have conversations and develop relationships and just be real people together was incredibly helpful in getting connected. And I will say, it is about relationships and some of the listservs, right? Like I have put questions out there and then somebody else responds and I realized they're only like 2 hours away from me. So can I, continue that conversation? And actually one of those conversations may turn into a new job opportunity for me. So it's really kind of just one thing to the next, But yes, you can do it. I wouldn't, now I'm interested what other people would have to say about that, because I am mid-career. So I didn't do a fellowship and I didn't, I'm not in a traditional academic setting. I do sometimes, I think, have a bit of imposter syndrome when I look at some of the job listings, right? When now job listings are specifically looking for CL fellowship trained folks. And I have been advised that even though I'm not officially CL trained, I do have experience, and I need to not be shy about, talking about that experience.
I think another thing is what kind of in asking yourself, in what capacity do you want to be seeing people with a CL focus? And so I believe the question specifically asked women's health and emergency psychiatry, because one thing that I found in applying for CL based jobs with other people who may or may not have had fellowships is that in the conversation, if you said, hey, I really have a big interest in women's health, and I would love to have that to be part of my job and my career here, it may have been a little bit easier to convince the person in charge of assigning you the job that, I'm CL boarded, I'm CL trained, and so it makes sense that I'd want that, versus while I'm fresh out of residency, I don't have any experience with a lot of women's health. I may have done like an elective in it in my 4th year or something, but it made it a little somewhat of the negotiation of your time that you may spend was a little bit more difficult. Does that mean that you could get a job with it? Absolutely. The question though of how much time and in what capacity you could do that job may make your likelihood of getting that career-based focus after having a fellowship a little bit more likely, partly because CL fellowship is so able to be malleable to your interests. And so if you went into CL fellowship saying, oh man, I'm really interested in women's health or emergency medicine, you could probably have a lot of electives in it and be able to say, hey, I have experience now with this. I just spent a full year doing fellowship. I had people training me with it. I had a couple publications while I was in fellowship about this concept. I think it may be a little bit easier to stand on a ground that says, look at what I've done to where I can put more time into this. Because sometimes I would hear people who did not have fellowship training would say, hey, I'm super interested in CL. I would love to get to take the CL job that you're offering, though you're offering some other outpatient jobs. And they said, oh, cool, you can take the outpatient job for general psychiatry and you'll be first in line to cover the CL service when it's needed. And so a yes to can you get a job with that focus, may have a better likelihood of having a higher ability to have that focus if you have more oomph behind what your experience would be.
Yeah, and I would second that, and I'll also kind of piggyback on something you said, David, and that is, not having the fellowship. I have learned that I kind of have to keep my ear to the ground and be that person that is the backup for the CL service, or is willing to kind of take on those extra responsibilities kind of, or to do some of those things to kind of, show people what I can do, basically, since I don't technically have the creds that everybody else does.
I think I'll add on, just in regards to experientially at different institutions I've been at, like even academic institutions, like when the need is there and the need needs to be filled, it doesn't matter if you have it or not. And so yeah, I think it comes down to your flexibility on what your interests are and like how specifically you just want to do clinical CL work. Because if you just want to do clinical CL work, there's a lot of places in the country that need CL interested psychiatrists, whether or not you have a fellowship. And I think that in academic centers, I think for sure it's going to be potentially a little more difficult. You might get potentially sidelined, but also if you find those places in which gaps need to be filled, people who don't even want to do CL end up getting pulled into doing CL work, and they're not fellowship trained for sure, and can end up like some. I just recently heard a story from a colleague of mine who had no inclination or plan to do CL work, but that just happened to be the job that was open, got plugged into it in a big academic institution, and then did it for 10 years. And so, I think there's a variety of factors that come into play that you can think about. The short answer is no. Like, you don't need fellowship training to do it.
Mira, go ahead.
I was going to say, just piggybacking on what Jai said, is that, right, a lot of it will be based on need. You can say in general, right, that if you are in big academic centers in big cities where you have a large congregation of subspecialists there, it might be harder. But if you are more flexible, if where you're going to be in the country, then you have a better chance of being able to have one of those positions without having the fellowship. But piggybacking on what David said, I think the fellowship also opens up so many doors for you to do a variety of things and get experience that you might not otherwise have. So it's it's what you're thinking about, what you want to do, where's your flexibility there. So if you're someone who maybe wants to do some inpatient at some point, or you're a little bit interested in doing, a combination of outpatient and CL, then maybe the fellowship isn't the thing for you. But if you're really interested in like the different areas of what CL offers, then thinking about the fellowship and what it can do for you is a good call. I think asking people who have done the fellowship versus not, right, and had their experiences in getting those positions is really important.
Thank you all very much. Really interesting question. Mira, I'm going to direct this to you first, and I'll open up the group. So someone in chat is asking, in addition to resources mentioned, what would be other resources to look for CL opportunities in California in particular? So Mira, I'll send that to you first, but then the rest of y'all want to weigh in how to look for opportunities specifically in one part of the country.
So I'd say informally, and this applies to any state, is that look at the programs in California or places and then like send messages. I did that at the end of fellowship because I wanted to stay in California. I just sent messages to different programs, and that was really helpful in just getting responses of what they had available. In addition to APA and ACLP, using actually Doximity can be really helpful. Doximity has like state narrowing, and that ends up getting you on the board for different recruiters that will then send you things for states specifically. So that can be a way of getting like state specific things sent to you.
I would add that if you're not from that state and you're wanting to move to that state, it may require a little bit more proactive ability with it. Because I can say that, the fact that I'm in Minnesota, I could easily find out, I could just go to Minnesota Psychiatric Society and kind of talk about other opportunities. But I do know that one of the pieces that we were discussing from a DEI perspective was, if you come from an area or you are currently training in an area or you're just working in an area that may not have as much exposure to the academia of CL, or even literally you're just not in the state that you're wanting to move to, it may take a little bit more time expectation, as well as some of the contacting of the places that you're interested in. If you're just kind of globally interested in a state, then that actually may be a little bit easier, because then you could kind of just pull around from different resources that could possibly be taken from that state. If you're interested in a specific place, then it would take specific contacting of people that would be there, which would require a little bit more of a collaborative effort and a little bit more of the networking type things that we were discussing. Any of the resources that were mentioned at the end of Shandon's conversation was also helpful. I've seen this happen a few times on my Facebook group, even to where someone says, hey, I'm not even from this state. How could I move to the state and get information? And then private messages occur after that.
All right, thanks, team. Another question in Q&A. For academia, can you please talk about negotiations for admin time and side gigs? I frequently found a lot of academic hospitals being reluctant to allow the latter. So let's talk about admin time, what it is not negotiated first, and then we'll move on to side gigs.
I will get started with this one because recently I did some negotiation about admin time. Right now I do have 0.2 FTE of admin time at University of Washington, and that was a group negotiation done by our supervisor, who essentially supervises a group of 7 psycho-oncologists, and he went ahead and negotiated it with Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. So the admin time is paid by the cancer center, not by the university. So that's a way of kind of getting into the hardcore of administration, who pays who in an academic center. Not everything is coming from what you generate. Actually, things in academic centers, especially for psychiatry, often come from, let's say, neurosurgery or surgery or oncology or different other specialties, the RVUs they're generating for the academic medical center a part of it gets shared among every specialty, and we all get money from that. And then there are like university physicians group in most academic centers, where they also are able to pay some of the faculty's salary. And then cancer center itself can pay some of the faculty's salary. So when you are negotiating for admin time, the thing we have to remember is somebody has to pay for that time. And that sometimes becomes pretty hard thing to make happen. And that's why it's kind of important to understand the structure of the organization and know who is paying you when you are getting into a job. And if you know the details of who is paying you, then the next thing you can do is to get into the negotiation part and say that, okay, so this is the value of the time I'm putting, and so I need to be paid for that. Or maybe you can also make an argument that, okay, so you are telling me to see 10 patients in a day, but when am I going to finish my notes, honestly? Are you expecting me to finish my notes by 12 o'clock in the midnight? So that can also be a negotiating point. The amount of work you're doing, especially in psych-oncology, there is a lot of collaboration. It's not only seeing the patient, it also collaborating with the infusion team and the transplant team and the oncology team and social work and different other entities. So where is this time coming from? So you can make this argument, and this argument was made to give us the academic time that we got. And recently I accepted a job offer back in OHSU, Oregon Health Science University. I'll be the program director for the fellowship program there soon. There also I negotiated for admin time again. And that was a different type of negotiation. There I really wanted to have a clinic and associated admin time given on the top of that clinic, again, paid by the Knight Cancer Center. So you need to know your payer first, who is paying you. And that way only you can make that negotiation happen. And take whatever, I mean, go for 0.2, but then don't shy away from taking 0.1. I mean, just because they're not ready to do 0.2, don't give up on that. Take the 0.1 and also give them the caveat, okay, so in the next 1 year, I see myself building up a program to make it 0.2 for myself. Are you okay with that? So you also have to have kind of like a shared push and pull with your chair, that you are going to do this and you are putting it up front when you are joining somewhere. And then you're kind of putting the chair, not necessarily, but putting the chair in a place of accountability where you're kind of going back again to him saying, oh, I told you that I was going to go for it. So now you got to support me because you encouraged me that this was something that we can make happen. So these are some of the ways of negotiating.
I often approach it as, how can I meet your needs? And so oftentimes a chair has to justify any type of time outside of clinical care, because if we just solely look at this from a numbers standpoint of productivity of a department, then theoretically the best department would be one that everyone only sees patients all day, every day, and there's no academic time, there's no research time, there's no educational time, so on and so forth. And so if we can say, well, if I have this time, what could I do with that time to best help with the goals of what the department is after? And so if they give you research time, it's both, well, who's paying for it, but it's also what the result will be of it. If I am getting educational time, it's not only who's paying for it, but it's, well, I'm teaching the residents that you have here. Or I'm teaching at the medical school, and we've seen that this is a very large piece of their academic curriculum that they have. Or for the example that was just given, I've taken on a leadership role in a teaching realm, and there's formal time that needs to be set aside for that, even from ACGME standards. And so being able to discuss, we want to have a residency here, we want to have our medical school here, we want to to have research output. Well, getting that protected time would allow me to meet the goals that you are attempting to achieve, and I can then show that I am using that time for the goal achievement that you're trying to go after. It kind of creates it a win-win situation rather than it sounding like you're begging to make the place lose money because you're not seeing as many patients. I can also say that one of the cool things with CL that was hinted at in just a second ago is if you have a subspecialty focus, then you may not just be having the opportunity to not only get funding for protected time, but also give to another specialty as well. And so if you find that you have an interest in one of the subspecialties of CL, go down the organ systems, right? Well, how does the psych cardiology, for instance, how does the cardiology output look from this hospital that I'm applying to? How do they have a high research output? Do they have a great cardiology fellowship where there's a lot of teaching and education time that may be occurring? Having the ability to collaborate with that extra piece, if that is available in your clinical focus, also gives you another avenue beyond just talking with your individual psychiatry chair.
Awesome. So great points, Al. Transitioning to the second part of the last question, which is how to negotiate side gigs with your academic medical center. Is that a thing? Can you do it? How do you go about it?
Not seeing anybody. I'm going to get started. So most academic centers usually have a non-compete clause where it says within this miles, you cannot practice for this many years and all of that. So, but exceptions can be made in most cases if you kind of talk with your chair and show them that it's not essentially undermining the interest of the academic center. For example, if you are doing an e-consult sitting in Washington and you are e-consulting somewhere in Idaho, honestly, that's not undermining University of Washington's financial interest. That's rather serving the underserved population in Idaho. So you can always make that case and make an argument to have an exception from the non-compete. As I am an international medical graduate and I did my J1 waiver, I would like to just mention, I don't know if there is any IMGs in this audience, that your waiver contract cannot have a non-compete clause. And that's by the requirement by the Department of Health and Human Services. So if you see any non-compete clause in your J1 waiver contract, so essentially you need to remove that. Your employer has to remove that. That's a legal thing to do. But otherwise, if you're not IMG, if you're not doing your waiver, most of the time, academic centers will have some non-compete. But again, everything is negotiable.
Just a small thing to add. I think some things you can look at are specific policies for academic centers around certain amounts of time that you can do things that are consultation or other types of things like presentations, as long as they're not directly competing with the work that you're doing at the academic center. Oftentimes they'll at baseline say like you can do like 8 to 12 hours, for this amount of time, and you can use that as a base to start discussing your projection of, with your chair of, I'm going to be spending this amount of time. So for instance, I do some consultation with PayPal, and I started off with having a conversation with a department around doing within that time period. If your side gig ends up progressing, though, it's going to take more time, oftentimes reducing your FTE just a little bit, so you're not at the 1 FTE can be another way that you can add in more time for side gigs and still maintain the majority of your salary at the academic center. Because oftentimes it's with like the 100% like FTE that they want, that those restrictions apply depending on the academic center.
An additional wrinkle to note also for the audience is a lot of times like state sponsored institutions, for example, like UT Southwestern, where I probably UIC, like it's just part of like state policy to not have you working for other people because you're being paid by the state. So that to then use state time to be working for a non-state organization would just be a huge conflict of interest for your population. Another thing to look at is if you need to make money on the side, because face it, like inflation is hurting all of us. I mean, come on, like in this economy, but like ask if the places you're looking at have internal moonlighting, like can you pick up extra shifts in like the emergency room or on the CL service or working at like a community like partner hospital to get more money. So that's a separate but related question you should be asking at your institution. Another question that is just come in, is it possible to have a 7-day on and off schedule in CL, or can we possibly negotiate with the organization? So the short answer is you can negotiate anything you want, whether they'll listen to you or not is a completely different question. But in y'all's opinions, like, is it something that could be accommodated in any of the places that you interviewed at? And if so, how?
I can jump in. I actually interviewed at a place that had this model, or was aiming to have like the lead psychiatrist at the hospital, or like the director of the CL service at that hospital wanted to have a model that was able to be sustained in the 7 on, 7 off way. So, I mean, I think the short answer is yes, you probably have to go hunting for it in regards to like, yeah, things are negotiable, but having a 7 on, 7 off model might require a major systemic shift for a place, and whether or not they'd be willing to accommodate that, I think is the major question. But I was surprised to find that that existed when I was interviewing and found that model. And so I think that just means that if you want it, then look for it, hunt for it, and see who's willing to negotiate around it. But just know that given that that's not the standard model for CL work, it's probably going to be harder to find.
I agree. I think you're spot on. I know quite a few people who do the 7 on, 7 off, even within CL, and they love it. They absolutely love it. But the key piece is, as exactly what you said, is if there's already a pattern of how CL is run at that current place, then convincing people to give up their weekends on a scheduled basis and going back and forth sometimes. Obviously, for 7 on, 7 off, you have to have someone who is on while you are off, and so you would have to have at least someone else to be able to be your back and forth between. Versus some people will just run their CL service and then they have the department kind of cover call on the weekends or something like that. And so that would create a very different shift to the milieu of CL at certain places. But we mentioned, you know, you don't need a CL fellowship to get a CL job, especially if we're in an area that desperately needs it. If you're in an area that desperately needs it and you walk in and you're the only psychiatrist who's doing it, or you're one of two, that could probably be a very easy conversation to have, because you're kind of going to be the person running the service. And they say, hey, as long as it gets covered type thing. Especially, I remember I rotated at a very rural hospital when I was in residency, and they didn't even have a psychiatrist to be on their CL service, and so they were offering a job to people, and it was like, whatever you want, you can kind of do. And so it really comes down to, is there already an established pattern that you're kind of walking into, and then you have to convince everyone that they're suddenly going to have to completely change how they structure their life? Or is it something, well, I'm kind of, you know, starting the mold here for a new thing, because there certainly is the people who do it certainly have found benefit in it. And so I don't think it's completely non-negotiable, but I think as was said previously, it really comes down to what the current milieu looks like and how likely they would be to shift it for someone who's brand new to the institution.
I would say, to flag one of the things that David was mentioning, if you are interviewing at a place that they're like trying to establish, or they desperately need a psychiatrist, and they say, oh yeah, we'll do 7 on, 7 off, like very much clarify with them who is going to provide coverage while you're not there, you know, or is it okay that there's no coverage when you're not there? Because especially if you are the person who's going to be starting this new program, oftentimes they'll say yes to get you to sign on, but then once you're there, they're like, no, you're actually going to be covering all the time until we can hire a second person.
Yeah, and if you're looking for something specifically like that and you're negotiating, make sure they put it in writing. Like put the terms of your, arrangement, whatever you've discussed, put it in writing, because otherwise, after you start, you don't have a whole lot of leverage.
So I guess moving on to some of the questions that were pre-sent. So especially if there is a job available at your home institution, like where you're training for residency or fellowship, how do you decide whether you wanted to stay at your home institution versus go elsewhere? Like what were some of your thought processes?
I can go. So I mean, it's an interesting question because I think a lot of personal values come into play with that question of like what would make you stay versus go. I mean, if it was a not pleasant training environment, you probably won't change too much if you stay. So that's probably worth considering. If it's really great, then that's probably a great point towards staying. And then obviously when you take into account your family, your other duties, and like I think major advantages of staying at your home institution, like regardless of culture, et cetera, is that you know what you're getting into. So you should know what you're expecting, I think, in ways that you might not be able to know about places, even when you interview and ask all the right questions that all of our amazing panelists, I think, have been giving information about. At the end of the day, you'll know the culture in a way that you won't at a new place that you'll be going. And so that's something to take into account. If you're someone who has a lot of anticipatory anxiety about the unknown, maybe home institution's a good place to be because you know what you're getting into. But I think that from a broad perspective, like you really just have to think about what your values are, whether or not your home institution matches those values, and whether or not it might be worth searching for a new place to be if it hasn't been the right fit. But yeah, that's an interesting question because I think it does involve a lot of personal reflection.
Yeah, I would say I've met very few people who don't have a strong opinion about where they trained. And that strong opinion is either I would never go there again, or I absolutely love that place and I wish they had a job available for me, but I had to leave because they didn't have one available for me. And so we often have I think everyone agrees that we have pretty clear opinions about the places that we've worked in our past. And if those opinions are positive, then what is it about that place that drives you to it? And is it something that is negotiable or extrapolatable to a different place? Or is it clearly, okay, I like this place because of the people that are here versus I like this place because of the values that they show, or I like this place because of the RVU network that they do. Like the reason that you may like a place may be very individualized for that place, or it may be a broad thing that you could take to another place as well. The other piece with that is what can I bring to the place that I trained that would advance what they currently offer? Because what commonly some of the feedback of people who don't want to stay at their own place is that, sometimes they feel like they would just, okay, well, I trained here, and I would just kind of be repeating what I was trained versus, well, I trained here and there's clearly something that I can give to this institution to improve and enhance its clinical acumen, its research, its education, or just their clinical care model that they employ. And that often also kind of runs hand in hand with how you feel you would be accepted at that institution as well. Some people say, I love my institution, but I don't think I could ever get past being seen as a trainee. They're always calling me by my first name, and I taught you everything you knew. So, don't argue with me about this type versus, oh, I was really treated as a colleague while I was here. And I feel like I could really bring more and expand what they give. Those were really kind of some of the thoughts that were going through my head when I was making decisions of whether or not to stay at certain places and whether or not I liked certain places. And it really comes down to what you value in your clinical work time, because obviously you're going to be a psychiatrist, and if in this setting will probably be a CL psychiatrist. And so you kind of got what you detail wise would want to be doing. And so it comes down to, well, what do you like about the area that you work with and the people that you work with, and how well do you think you can actually pull that into an advancement of both your career and their clinical acumen?
I think some just even practical things, if you're thinking about staying at your institution, is that your experience as an attending at that institution can be very different too than as a fellow, because you aren't familiar with what are the RVUs, what does vacation accrual look like, what are the benefits. So making sure that if you're thinking about that, that you are asking questions of the attendings that you're working with or other attendings in the department, so you can understand what you're going to be going into as an attending and what those expectations are. Other things to think about is, is the rate of progression in terms of like, if you're going to be a clinical instructor or a clinical associate professor, what does that look like for you if you're coming in from the institution? And, as David was saying, what your goals are, and if that fits with like the picture that, right, the chair for your department is looking for. So if you are really interested in women's mental health, but you're going to have to play a role where you're fitting in and covering a different subspecialty or something else for some time, are you okay with that? Or are you going to try and look for something outside?
I was going to make one comment and I think it applies to moving from fellowship to potentially a first job, but I also think it applies to any potential job change. I've made a couple of major shifts in my career and have agonized, right, over, do I want to stay? Do I want to go? Is it better here? Is it better there? And, one of my mentors told me at one point, you can't know what it's like really to be someplace until you're there, right? Until you have taken the job. When you're coming from someplace, often you have a depth of experience, good, bad, and different, right? And it's hard to get an apples to apples kind of data set for someplace that you haven't been.
Oh, great point, Valerie, which actually brings me to the next question, which can be very personal for some of us. In residency, like, you're done after you're done. Like, you have no choice but to move on. Like, same with fellowship. But for those of us in the panel who were at a job and then moved to another job, how did you make that decision? Like, hey, I want to move from another job? Because just personally, like, my model when like my family immigrated from India is like, you pick a job and you just stay there for life. But as we're learning, like, most people don't stay at the same job for the rest of their lives. Like, that can actually be like foolish in some cases. So for those of you who move jobs, how did you decide it was time to move?
I'll get started. So the first time when I moved job after my first faculty job at OHSU, I knew that I needed to work in psycho-oncology because that's my preferred area where I really wanted to work. I saw myself for long term. So I started looking at the ACLP job board and I found this pure psycho-oncology job and went for it. So that time, the motivation was the job description, purely that. This time, when I'm again moving job, this time the motivation is a little bit more personal. I think ideally, I would love if I could transplant Fred Hutchinson to Portland because I love the job so much and I love my supervisor so much. So I haven't even dreamed that a job can be a job without any component of burnout in it. So my colleagues and my supervisor are that great. So, I mean, this time the motivation is personal. So you kind of know when you have to kind of move job from different angles in your personal experience. Sometimes it could be very objective things like job description or personal needs, but other times you can also have other motivations like where there is no place to grow in your job. For example, you started a program, you became the director of that program, and now the next step would be to, I don't know, maybe a program director, but you don't want to go into the academic line of things. Or maybe the next step is to become the chair, and you kind of know that there are 5 people standing in the line for chairship. So there is not enough space for you to grow. That could be one motivation. That's when you know. And the other thing could be a burnout. Actually, when you see that every job, mostly all jobs come with some burnout, but mostly there are different ways of managing and making room for your well-being. But sometimes you might be in the corner. Sometimes you might find yourself that you have done everything. You have attended all these burnout related like speeches and everything that goes around in the social media, but nothing is helping. Then that is actually a situation where we need to change the place that's giving you the burnout. And don't we should not be feeling shy or bad or guilty about it. We should be moving on. We should be going to the next one and see whether that works.
I can speak on this since I've switched a few times. I will say the large majority of my transitions have been due to personal reasons, not professional ones. Now, that being said, I've been in 2, 3, 4 jobs since I've been at a fellowship. And the second job, like I was already planning to be leaving because I had gotten married and my wife and I wanted to be in a new place. So I was looking already. But it's like one of those things that you can't quite predict. I switched into that job for a personal reason, which was I was in a long distance relationship. I won't get into the details. Anyways, I switched for a personal reason. I needed a more consistent schedule, which my first job wasn't able to do. And I knew I needed to be in that more stable hours position, but my colleagues were nothing like those in my first job. This was the same institution, just a different job description. And that I like for the first time in my like training and like career, which like really early, I felt like I was burning out. And if I hadn't been planning to leave, I think I would have been planning to leave for a professional reason, which would be the first, like would have been the first time that had even occurred to me to do. And so, I mean, it's something to pay attention to. I think I just want to emphasize that I mentioned the culture of work environment before, but like, I think assessing your colleagues, I know panelists have talked about this as well. And Chandan mentioned this at the beginning, like, and Dr. Fleisch's comments, like, know your supervisor, know the people around you, know what they're like, and also know who you are and what you're about. Because I think one of the things that can be the case, I mean, we're CL, right? So the liaison thing is huge. We think it's inherent in everyone. Of course, we want to help people connect and like we want to collaborate and we want to work together. And unfortunately for all of us, not everyone wants to do that. And as someone who's CL minded, I noticed that like I would get taken advantage of in my attempts to be collaborative. And so just pay attention to who your colleagues are and what they're about and what their level of initiative is. And because that's obvious, that's going to play a role in regards to all this. So anyways, I ended up being incredibly glad that I was switching out of that job for other reasons. It just so happened, but I was glad I got out of there. But my other switches have been personal, so it's not really worth recounting those, but that was just a tidbit from that one switch.
One thing that I've kind of extrapolated from an interview question that I would ask whenever I would apply to a job, I think I've already kind of mentioned it here, but there's a little more to it, is what brought you here and what kept you here, especially for people who'd been at the job for a long time. And so similarly, asking that to yourself, what brought you here? What kept you here? Is that a positive reason, or you're like golden handcuffs, negative reason? And do those reasons continue to advance you towards your both career and personal goals? And if it doesn't align with your career and personal goals, and if what brought you there really isn't the reason that you're there anymore, and what was keeping you here really isn't there, that gives more evidence to the need to change what you're doing versus, oh, well, times are tough, but why I came here is still pretty prominent, and why I wanted to stay here is good, and it's a good reason, and it is moving me forward in my professional and personal goals. Then that may make you lean more towards, well, let's see where we can go with this and stay with this job. And so that's kind of the flow that I say whenever I have someone ask about changing jobs and when you're changing. So what brought you here, what kept you here, is it positive, and then is that fulfilling your career and personal goals?
The last thing I would add to what everyone's amazing statements on this is, you are replaceable in an organization. They will find somebody to do the job. And so I know I'm the type of person who I worry about what I will do, how it'll impact everyone else. As Jai was saying, right, we're liaison focused. But when we are not thinking about ourselves and we're worrying about the impact on everyone else, we're not really going to move forward. So it's okay to be selfish and think about the things that you need to do for yourself, and then make a choice to move forward, to take care of yourself and do what's best for you, and not worry about how it's going to impact the team. Because if you have good relationships with people, you'll continue to have good relationships with them, when you leave that position, and then continue to maintain that moving forward. But you really need to be thinking about what works for you and put yourself first when you're thinking about job situations.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I mean, my wife watches this show. You may have heard of it, RuPaul's Drag Race, and every episode, RuPaul, the host, says, "If you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love someone else?" And I think that's really applicable here. Like at the end of the day, you have to love yourself and the job you do, otherwise you cannot serve anybody else in your CO role. So can I get an amen? We're a little under 10 minutes left. So 2 more questions that were submitted ahead of time, but I just want to make sure we answer. Let's say you have applied to multiple places and you are lucky enough to get possible job offers from multiple places. There is no match in the real world. So how do you give yourself the most time to decide between different job offers, which one you want to do? Like, do you want to go with Betty? Do you want to go with Veronica? This is very dated reference. Go on.
Well, I guess having a plan is important. I mean, if there are 2 or 3 jobs, and the first thing would be to kind of make a mental list of personal and career pros and cons. And I mention them separately because I have seen in my really short career that they're always like in opposition with each other. What is good for career is most of the time not good for personal goals. So I have to align, I have to bring back the personal goal from somewhere to align with the career goal in most cases, but sometimes otherwise. So it's good to have a mental list of the pros and cons of every job that you are considering in terms of your personal growth and career goals. And then go from there. I mean, also to have a realistic timeline. I mean, you cannot be thinking forever. So you've got to give yourself a couple of weeks, or a lot of people I know, they want to think clearly and they have their own rituals of thinking clearly. So you can even try to do that as well, thinking away from your family or thinking away from what other things are your responsibilities. Sometimes that clarifies, clears our mind a little bit better. And also, I always keep time to talk with my mentors, at least 2 or 3 mentors. I would have to talk with all of them for any job change, or even if I'm thinking of interviewing somewhere. The first thing for me is always going back to my mentors and discussing with them. And often a time they answer a similar question like David just said, that why are you going for this? What is in there for you? And what are you not having here in this position? So like having a timeline and plan probably is the only way to go.
You can also be honest with the people when you're interviewing, and it gives you a picture of how they would respond to that. But when I was first interviewing out of fellowship, I was honest with the places I was interviewing and letting them know, yeah, I'm also interviewing at other places. And when they sent me an offer, I would say, this place, I'm waiting to hear back from this place, this place gave me these offers. I'd like to use that and utilize that information to try and counter and negotiate for certain things. If a place is like pressuring you and they're just like, oh no, we need to have the answer by the end of the week, it's probably not a good sign. And so, taking that, and it gives you a sense of what's the culture there, how are they going to respond? Are they negotiable if you are asking them and bringing them points from other things? Harkening back to Dr. Fleisch's, this is a buyer's market. And so you can utilize the offers that you're getting from places to extend your timeline And you can also let people know, honestly, like, I need a little bit more time. There's something that I'm sorting out, you know, whether it be another job offer or, you know, I have other things that I'm weighing. And if they're able to give you that time, and if they're not, and if they're trying to push you, then it's also usually not a good sign.
I was gonna piggyback on that, which is just to say that, um, just like you referenced, the buyer's market thing is huge. And you know, the first job that I ended up taking, you know, they waited, like, I want to say over a year for me to come on board, essentially, because I was still in fellowship. I was interviewing a little bit early, and I had promised myself that I wouldn't take a job that wouldn't let me take 2 months off after fellowship. And they really wanted me to start in August, and I was like, I'm not going to do it. Like, I need to start in September. And like, they were willing, at the end of the day, they were willing to negotiate. They wanted to bring me on, and that extra month wasn't that big of a deal at the end of the day. And so, I mean, just know what you're worth. I mean, yeah, just know that it's a buyer's market. So like, yeah, get the things that you think are important to you.
Awesome.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to piggyback on that and say, yeah, I think it's one of the main focuses of it is ensuring that you know what your goals are, what your core values are, and what you really want out of a job. And oftentimes it really does come down to your priority list. And you know, well, yeah, that's a big deal, but is it as much of a big deal as this over here? But even the concept of once you have your priorities, sometimes I completely agree with the concept of talking to mentors and family and spouses, if you have a spouse, because kind of gets you out of your head a little bit. And it says, hey, you know me fairly well. Think like me. And what do you think I would want? Because I've clearly talked with my goals with you to some degree, mentor, family member. What would your thoughts be in that regard if you were solely looking at it from my perspective? Being able to look at it from my angle, knowing my goals, my options, and my values, things that I really care about, how is that going to go? And then when it comes down to it, because you'll likely find that many of them fit a lot of those pieces, a statement that I often make when I'm teaching someone from a clinical standpoint is, there's a lot of correct answers. And there's not a lot of absolute wrong answers. And we need to catch what the absolute wrong answers are. But then when there's kind of this back and forth of what the best correct answer is, many of them are correct answers. And especially with a job opportunity, they're not a permanent answer either, unless you make them a permanent answer. And so the fear of one versus the other, they may both be very correct answers because you probably did a pretty good job with siphoning out the wrong answers.
Thank you all so much. And thank you everyone again who's attended. We're just about time, but there's one more question I wanted to ask all of y'all on the panel. If you could just give one tip you have to attendees in regards to how to successfully network at a conference like CLP. So David, since you're on the screen, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I love this tactic that I discussed previously, where it's like, if you're interested in a place, whether it be to train or whether it be to work, it is good to see how and what they are presenting about at ACLP, especially if we're talking specifically in the focus of ACLP. I remember telling a few people who were residents who were applying to fellowship, you may want to at least go and hear the program director when they present, because they're probably going to be the one that's going to be teaching your didactics. They're going to be the one. And so if you get bored during their presentation, you may find that the content delivery may be fairly similar. But also you can find how, if you're interested in a certain research area, or if you're interested in a certain clinical focus, how much are they presenting about this context? And if you want to be able to create those relationships, one thing that is very helpful is to ask a question. And it's very simple. As I believe all of us have probably made a presentation in our life, both audience members and panelists. And when no one asks the question at the end, it feels very awkward, and it almost feels like, okay, was any of my information any good? If someone asks a question, says, really good presentation you made there, and I really like how you talked about blah 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 blah, that makes the presenter feel really good, and it makes them more open to having further conversations with you afterwards. And it's a very simple and subtle piece, but it allows for them to at least hear your name and to be able to show that you have an interest in it. I don't necessarily say to do this, but I knew someone who applied for a completely different fellowship who would stand up and say, this is my name, applying for fellowship. Wanted to be sure that I made myself known to you. I wouldn't necessarily say go that far, but certainly allow yourself to open some of those opportunities to where you clearly could have the opportunity to speak to someone, especially for smaller things like poster presentations and stuff, to where it's a very crowd environment and you can just walk up and kind of have a collaborative conversation. You'll probably hit it off with someone that's at the place that you're interested in looking at, and then you can create the relationship from there.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, go.
I think go to these networking events and say hi. I mean, like that maybe sounds too simple, but like for the behind the scenes view, like literally like for the early career panel, like people are brainstorming left and right how to get you to come. They want you to come and say hi. So I mean, like we've all got a little bit of social anxiety, or at least in my inner circle, everyone has a little bit of social anxiety. And so just push through it. People want to talk to you, especially conferences like ACLP and AAP, which are like smaller, friendly conferences. Like they want to be approached and they want to talk to you about why their institution's the best, or why where they trained was amazing, or worst case scenario, why you shouldn't go where they're at. But people want to talk to you, and people tend to be pretty forthcoming. And yeah, so say hi.
Thank you. Pramalika?
Yeah, I'm glad that get involved very early. I got into ACLP, I got the membership, I think, when I was a PGY2. And I volunteered for this subcommittee, which I'm going to chair this year. So that shows you the value of perseverance and persistence within an organization. So you got to get involved early, and you also have to be ready to volunteer for things when they're sending out. ACLP frequently sends out requests to join those subcommittees, committees, SIGs, and all of that. So you can easily kind of make that happen. And then from there, you will know who you like to hang out with or who you need to network with.
Thank you. Mira? Mira,
Unmute myself. I would say also making sure that you go to the exhibit halls, and if you have a little bit of social anxiety or a little bit of an introvert like me, and large networking events are kind of scary, you can go to the poster sessions actually and go and check out posters that you find really interesting. And then usually there's like one person, and then you can talk to that one person and have a conversation with them and get to know a bit more about the place that they work. But the poster sessions, the exhibit halls, and then if you have a friend who's more extroverted, like I have with Shandon, which is awesome, then you can always ask them for help in getting to know people as well.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Valerie?
Well, I don't know what else I have to add. My strategies usually are to kind of just get over myself and go say hello and introduce myself. I have also done the, make friends with an extrovert and tag along. That can work very well. In the larger sessions, particularly if I notice somebody that I have seen in the session before or the session yesterday, right? A familiar face, I will, sit near them, next to them, introduce myself, strike up a conversation, that kind of thing. And, go to the events and then take care of yourself, because some of us will need to recharge after that much peopling.
Speaking of, thank you all so much. We've reached more than the end of our time. Thank you all for attending this talk, and a special thank to our panelists, including Dr. Fleisch, who couldn't be here, for talking us through the process, how to apply for CL job, whether it's your first one or your next one. Also, special thanks to Holly Reister, who's behind the scenes making this whole ship sail in the first place, and to all our friends at ACLP. Hope to see you all at CLP 2022 annual meeting in Atlanta next month, or at other conferences. But don't be a stranger. Best wishes. You'll find in the chat my email if you want a copy of the slides themselves, but the recording will be posted online soon. Happy Sunday, y'all. Be well.
Thanks, Jonathan.